So welcome everybody. I happen to be somebody who likes to be punctual, so I tend to start on time. So again, I welcome everybody and I appreciate all the kind words and support, and we're just going to move a little bit forward here. There's a few housekeeping items I wanted to talk about. The first is we will have a YouTube channel which will start sometime soon, and so there'll be more things posted on that, so people who want to hear more about things that I have to say and maybe other relevant subjects, please consult the YouTube channel. The second thing, as far as this webinar goes, there's two functions, I'm told. One is a chat group, which is for people to communicate with each other, which I won't have anything to do with. And then there's a Q&A part. And once I'm done with my initial presentation, I will look at the Q&A and pick some of the relevant questions. So those are the two main housekeeping things. I also want to emphasize, as I've said before, that when I'm speaking here, I'm speaking for myself. I'm not speaking as a representative of any foundation or any community or any society or anything else. This is Tom talking about how I see the world. This is also not meant to be medical advice. It's not meant to diagnose, treat, or tell people what to do. As always, we should always consult with our trusted medical care provider. So nothing in this is to be construed as giving specific medical advice to anybody. So the next thing I wanted to say is, and it's become common in medical circles to, for doctors and other people in doing medicine to disclose conflicts of interest. And so in the second part, which is really the main part of this talk, when I'm going to talk about things you can do, there's a whole lot of different things that I'll be talking about, some of which, and I have different financial relationships to some of these things. Some of the things I have no financial relationship to, and others of them, you know, I went for the first 30 plus years of my practice essentially looking for things that could help people, and sometimes I would find them, and they were either not available or very difficult to be available. And in a sense, I just said, well, that's what I think you should use, but I can't help you find them. As a result of my family getting involved and we making these new businesses, Dr. Cowan's Garden and Human Heart, Cosmic Heart, we now have the possibility of helping people to get some of these products. So, and some of the things, the water, people have sent me water, people are letting me try out their water, people are letting me try out some of the other things. There's a whole different arrangement of financial relationships. Most of the things, if there are things we sell in our store, it's because they were either difficult to get or we couldn't find them otherwise, and so we felt like we could do a service by helping provide them to people. The next thing I want to say is I'm told by my technical advisory people that this talk will be posted into the clouds. And so as a result of that, I decided to bring my umbrella. You could see this here, just in case if we put it into the clouds, that might mean it will rain. So if it does rain, I will have my umbrella and I will be able to keep going. And finally, I hope and expect in a way that people have actually seen previous of my previous webinar, maybe some of the interviews, and in particularly the 40-minute presentation by the Dr. Andy Kaufman that I will probably be referring to. Because I'm not going to go over all that stuff. I did that. And I'm expecting people will have heard that, and so they really are wanting me to move this forward as far as what we can do. So I will give a brief synopsis of my understanding of our current health situation, but I intend to devote most of the time to describing what I do. And yeah, so that's that. And finally, for those of you who saw my Weston Price or Wise Traditions podcast, you know that I have a tendency to tear up a little bit. And basically I tear up at pretty much every funeral or wedding. And apparently now I tear up during my own webinars. So I will try to keep track of that, not let that happen. So I think that's all my housekeeping issues. And so that took about 5 minutes. So let's move on. So I have come to understand that not everybody understands what I mean by the problem of the testing for the coronavirus and the accuracy of the test. And this got particularly driven home to me because I'm part of a number of physicians groups who are interested in these issues. And recently a physician sent me an email, not specifically to me, but to the group, saying she has run upon a test for the coronavirus that she knows is 84.6% accurate, and it could have been 86.4. The important point was it was 84.6 or some number in the 80s point something percent accurate. And then I received another email from another doctor saying he had a test that was 100% accurate. And they were telling us this because they said, if you want to get a hold of this test, you could go to this place and we could order the test so we could presumably use them with our patients. Now, of course, my first response to the 84.6 offer was, I would only want to do a test if it was 84.7% accurate. 84.6, not good enough. But the interesting thing about that offer is it actually explains the entire problem of the testing. And let me try to go over this once more because I realize how complex it is. And this is so key to understanding this whole situation. So as I said, virologists, infectious disease people, immunologists, etc., internists, anybody involved in this has agreed for the last 100 years that there's a certain strategy that we use for understanding whether a disease has an infectious etiology or not. And those agreements are called Koch's postulates. Now, I do know that Koch's postulates have some issues, but that's way too complicated to get into right now. Basically, everybody agrees that that's how we prove infectious disease, and they go essentially like this. Number one, everybody has the same or very similar symptoms. Number two, if you test all those people with symptoms, 100% have the organism that you're looking for. Number three, if you take 100 normal people, none of whom have those symptoms, then none of them have that organism that you're looking for. And number four, if you take that organism from the sick people and purify it so that you have nothing else in there but that particular organism, and you inject that into another person, which you wouldn't want to do, but into an animal, then they will become sick with the same disease, and they will have the organism in them, and then you can keep it going. And so an example of that would be strep throat. Almost everybody who has strep throat has a sore throat, they have a fever, they have swollen glands, more or less the same symptoms with everybody. Now, if you take those people, 100% of them will grow strep in a throat culture, not any other organism, only strep. And then if you take 100 normal people, none of them have strep growing in their throat. And then if you purify the strep and you inject it into an animal or expose it to an animal, they will also get sick. The animal has to be susceptible. And then you've proven that strep is the cause of this person's sore throat. Now, again, I understand that there is more to it than this, and someday I will get into the more to it part of this, but that's not germane to this situation. The same thing works for viral infections, and I gave the example of chickenpox. Everybody has more or less the same symptoms. All of them have millions of copies of this virus in their blood. None of the people who don't have the chickenpox symptoms have the virus. And if you purify it, meaning you only have that virus, you expose an animal that's susceptible, they will get sick with whatever their version of chickenpox is. Now, that technique, those postulates, that way of seeing the world is how we prove infectious etiology. And I would say, period. And for the people who say we don't use Koch's postulates anymore, that is actually true. But the reason for that, it's partly true, because there are papers now about the coronavirus that say they are attempting to prove Koch's postulates. So it hasn't been totally abandoned. But my point of it was, this started with the whole polio thing, where they couldn't prove Koch's postulates. And so they came to a fork in the road, and they said they had one of two choices: either abandon that polio was caused by a virus, or discard the rules for how we prove infectious etiology. And unfortunately, in my opinion, for humanity, they decided to discard the rules, and then it was off to the races. Now, again, this test is called a gold standard. Once you have a gold standard test, then you can do a surrogate test, which is what the PCR or RT-PCR test is, which is the test they're using to say that people have an infection with coronavirus. And the way this works is they basically isolate or take a purified virus. They try to find out a unique part of the RNA in this case, and they essentially amplify it. And so then they say, if we can find this unique piece of DNA, that proves that the symptoms, the disease was caused by the coronavirus. But as I've said over and over again, the founder of this test said, you can only do this once you have a gold standard for proving that virus fulfills Koch's postulates. Because here's what happens. So you have people with strep throat, and you prove that their symptoms are strep throat. Then you could take a unique piece of the strep, do this PCR test, and then you could take 100 people with strep throat, and you could do the PCR test, and you would find something like 96, 97, 98 of the 100 have a positive PCR test at the number of cycles that you went through. That tells you that the false negative test is 3 or 4%. So then you know the false negative rate. And then you take 100 people who have no symptoms, and they have a negative strep culture, so you know they don't have strep. And then you do the PCR test at a number of amplification cycles, and you find, as happens with all biological tests, as happens with all PCR tests, that say 2 or 3 or 4 or 10 or whatever the number is, are positive. That's your false positive rate. The problem here is nobody did the Koch's postulates part. Nobody did 100 or 500 people who have symptoms, have purified coronavirus from them, shown that the coronavirus is not in the normal people, and then put it through an animal and prove sickness. Therefore, you have no idea, and I can't emphasize this enough, you have no idea what the false positive or false negative rate is. So all these numbers are completely bogus. So you could say, well, Tom, how do you know that? Well, I know it because when they publish this, they say that, and they'll say, for instance, we proved Koch's postulates, showing that they still believe in Koch's postulates, because here's what we did. We took some snot from somebody who was sick, we incubated that in lung cancer cells. Then it produced all these particles, which, as I will talk about in a minute, we know that lung cancer cells, because they're poisoned, they produce these exosomes, which are actually identical to the virus. That's what Andy has proved in his talks. So then they purify the virus, they take some of the RNA, they try to make an animal sick. In this case, it was a mouse. But it turns out they couldn't make normal mice sick with this purified virus. So they had to use genetically altered mice who are susceptible and essentially immunocompromised. And only then could they make them sick. So that proves nothing, folks. You cannot do, that's not how you prove infectious etiology. All that proves is that if you incubate snot with lung cancer, you'll get a whole lot of debris, some of which has some RNA segments which will light up on an amplified PCR test. Now, the interesting thing about this is, so if we go back to this doctor offering me this test that was 84.6 or 86.4% accurate, it's obvious that if you say something is 84.6, that means you must have done 1,000 people and you must have purified the virus, these whole Koch's postulates, on 1,000 people. So that's your gold standard. And then you can do the PCR test and find out that it's only negative or only positive in, you have to do both. You have to show the people who are sick, and you get certain people don't light up, that's your false negative. And if certain normal people, certain number of people light up, that's your false positive. But because they never did the first, they never did the gold standard, not only didn't they do it on 1,000 people, because if they only did it on 10 people, then the best you could say is it's 10% or 20%. If they did it on 100 people, the best you could say is it's 93 or 94% accurate. But to say the statement that it's 84.6 means that you must have done this comparison to the gold standard with 1,000 people, which is simply ridiculous. There is no science in this at all. Now, people then who could ask me, well, how come they do this? And all I can say is I am determined not to get into motives of other people or economics or politics. But all I can say is this is exactly the situation with vaccine issues and vaccine research. And here's what I mean by that. Every drug, every medical device that we use, we have a very particular way of finding out how much toxicity, how much side effects there is to this drug or device. What we do is we take 1,000 people or 10,000 or however many people, and we give one set the drug, and then we give a match set of 1,000 people or whatever the number, matched as closely as possible, and we give them an inert placebo, and then we run the trial for as long as it would take to see if any side effects show up, any negative consequences show up. It could be a month, it could be 30 years. Because if you're doing a vaccine that you give at birth, whose side effect is ADD or ADHD, or at least you're worried about that, you may have to wait for 7 years before you know. So that's how we test medicines. That's how we test devices. Everybody agrees on that. Except with vaccines, they don't do that. They do a new vaccine, and they test it against a different vaccine. And for those of you who want the facts on this, I would go to the ICANN document where they documented exactly which vaccine. So I'm just going to make up, because I don't remember which vaccine they tested against which one. So these are not accurate examples, but they show the point. So you test chickenpox against the Hep B vaccine. And then you say, how can you test it against Hep B? And they say, well, we know that Hep B doesn't have any side effects, has no toxicity, therefore we can use it as the control. And then you say, well, how do you know that? Well, because we tested the Hep B against the placebo. What was the placebo? That was the MMR vaccine. So how do you know that the MMR vaccine is safe? Because we tested it against the placebo. So what was the placebo? The placebo was the DPT vaccine. And so that we know is safe. So what was the placebo with the DPT? That was the chickenpox, which all we're asking is do proper studies, don't do this circular argument. And that's exactly what's happening with the PCR test. They tested against another PCR test. That wasn't tested against the gold standard, so you have no idea how accurate or specific that was. And then you keep going, and then everybody forgets that the original one was tested against another PCR test. And then you basically have propaganda, not science. That's the problem here. Now, over the last few days and weeks, people have come up with all sorts of other arguments to me, trying to demonstrate that this must be an infection with the virus. Even though it's very clear that there is a way, and I would actually say there's only one way, and that is to use the gold standard to demonstrate infectious etiology. So people say things like, well, there's 2,000 people who died in the same place of this, so it must be an infection, which is, of course, ridiculous, because unless you think dropping the Hiroshima bomb was a virus or an infection, what I'm told is 500,000 people died more or less the same day or week, or I don't exactly know how soon. So a large amount of people dying in a certain proximity has nothing to do with proving infectious etiology. And then they say, well, but this is spreading all over the world, as if something that spreads proves infectious etiology, because of course it doesn't. And an example of that was apparently they had a nuclear explosion in Chernobyl, and then over time it spread over to all throughout Europe, I'm told, and made people sick all over Europe. Unless you think the Chernobyl accident was a virus, it's very clear, and I could give you many other examples, and Andy went through the entire problem with the whole 1918 flu pandemic, where they literally proved that you could not transmit this so-called virus. They did it by having people, one person who was sick and another person who was not sick, and they did this with 100 people. They did it at the Boston Health Department, and they both held their breath, and then they put their lips almost touching as if they were going to kiss. They opened their mouth, and then after they held their breath, the person who was sick exhaled into the mouth of the person who wasn't sick, and not once in the 100 people could they transmit the virus. They did a bunch of other studies on this and essentially demonstrated this could not possibly be an infection. So even the transmissibility all over the world does not prove that it's infection. Again, the only way to do that is to do it the way we're told is the only way, which is the Koch's postulates way. And then the final thing that I get from people is, which in some ways surprises me, in some ways doesn't, is, but how could the entire medical profession be wrong about this? And I mean, in some ways that's a good point, but last night I decided to list 10 things which I think we could all agree on the medical profession in the last approximately 150 years or so apparently got wrong. So let me just read this. And by the way, people say, Tom, you should take notes and write things down for your talks. I did. See, I can't really read it because I can't read my own writing, but I did write it down. So in the 1870s, there was a treatment for schizophrenia run by the Quakers called moral therapy, where they basically took the worst of the schizophrenics and they put them in houses. And the rules were you had to take a hot bath and wear clean clothes. And the people had to eat 3 meals a day, and the staff had to be nice to them. And they stayed there for about a year. And they reported in the medical literature something like a 60% or so remission rate. and it was a durable remission. In other words, they looked like they were cured. So anybody who wants to learn more about this, I would read the book Mad in America by a guy named Whitaker. Then eventually the psychiatrists took it over, and they started doing their lobotomies and their chemotherapy. And as of now, their cure rate for schizophrenia is now about 0%. So that's one place. Even in the 1918 flu pandemic, there's probably many factors responsible for that. There's certainly the possibility of the radio wave new exposure. But another one was the advent of a medicine, which we all know, called aspirin, which was created by the Bayer company. And it was the new wonder drug, especially for treating flus. And many of the people, if not most of the people, died from hemorrhage or bleeding. And so they were giving people, the medical profession and just lay people, giving people 20 to 30 aspirins per day to treat the flu. Now, I think all of us realize that the main side effect from aspirin, especially an overdose like that, is bleeding or hemorrhage. So I'm sure that had something to do with it. And then we had the smoking, which was promoted for decades by the medical profession as something to calm your nerves. And then we go into x-raying of people's feet for fitting them for shoes. That was considered safe. And then we go into the thalidomide, which was a medicine used to treat morning sickness, which resulted in thousands of birth defects. Then we go into bone marrow transplants for treating breast cancer, which never worked. Then we did, which I talked about the last time, we had such a poor understanding of the microbiome that even when I was in medical school, we were still attempting to sterilize people's gut flora as a way to help them, which of course never worked. Then we move into treating women with estrogen, which now we know caused them to get breast cancer and uterine cancer. And then finally, we have the Vioxx debacle, which resulted in giving a headache medicine to people that resulted in at least 50,000 deaths, and some people say a lot more. And then the final one I'll say is, even when I had to get my license in California, we were required to take a course or do an online program to learn how to prescribe opiates to people, because we were told we were under-prescribing opiates. And now, I don't know how many years later, and I don't know how many deaths, we now have to take a course to maintain your license, teaching you how not to prescribe opiates, because we realized we killed thousands, if not more people. So I'm sorry, I just can't buy the argument that just because this is conventional wisdom or the medical profession believes it, that means it must be true. So then we move into, and there's a whole lot more I could say about the testing and the isolation and all this stuff. But I would encourage people who are interested in that to, again, go to the work of Andy Kaufman, who's much more of a molecular biologist, not by official training, but by interest than I am. And he will explain the whole thing. So if that's the case, then the next obvious question is, so what is the problem here? And why are people dying? I'm not going to get into, is it true that so many more people are dying? Is it not true? Is it overblown or whatever? I have no inside knowledge of that. All I can say is it appears that there are a lot of people sick from something that seems fairly new. Now, one of the basic source of information that we have as to what is actually wrong with them are two major things. The first is they have a hyper-inflammatory or so-called cytokine storm reaction in their lungs. In other words, their immune system is overstimulated for some reason and is basically making an attack on the lungs. So that's one thing we need to explain. The second, and this was very succinctly and I'd say brilliantly revealed by the New York City critical care doctor, who said, we are not seeing a pneumonia. We are not even seeing a viral pneumonia, even though I would admit he walked back from saying this can't possibly be a virus, because my suspicion is that might have been the end of his career. But he's saying we're not seeing pneumonia. We're not seeing anything that looks like a viral pneumonia. We're seeing something that looks like hypoxia or altitude sickness. In other words, something is interfering with the bioavailability of oxygen, and essentially they're suffocating. So those are the two facts which we have to explain. Now, the first thing I would say, and also the reason I'm going into this again, is when I talk about what I think we should do, not particularly about this particular situation, but in general, because I think this isn't just an accentuation of what was happening before, we have to account for those two things. So let's talk about the first. Why would people have a hyperactive immune response? So the first thing I would say is I wrote a whole book about that. That's what happens when you inject aluminum in a person. That's why they put aluminum in vaccines, to make you have a activated immune response, period. Now, we have very conclusive evidence, and I'm not going to get into that, how I know that, but that if you put inhaled nanoparticles of aluminum in the air, if you have intensely air polluted environment, which was certainly the case in northern Italy and Wuhan and a lot of other places, then you will have inhaled, therefore lung-based hyperactive immune response. That should be no surprise to anybody. That is exactly what we're talking about. Now, other people, and I would say the causation here could be, and certainly actually is, multifactorial and complicated. So there's researchers who are attempting to document that some of the hardest hit places have a new onset of, glyphosate in, exposure or vaporized into the air because of biofuels and other crops that are being used even as heating fuel, etc. So we have yet another reason that glyphosate is essentially genotoxic. So it breaks down your genes. It creates different forms of RNA, which is exactly what we're talking about when we see the expression of exosomes. As Andy points out, many, many things will increase the body's production of these messengers called exosomes. So toxins will, probably glyphosate, probably heavy metal exposure. All these things have substantial literature basis for saying this is the basis of this hyperactive immune response. So then the next question is, well, what about the low oxygen? Did somebody do something to the oxygen levels in the air in these places? And again, even though I would admit, and I think have always said, we have no particular proof of this in the medical literature, for the very simple reason that, similar to vaccines, nobody has studied it. But we do know that, number one, electromagnetic fields, probably accentuated 4G, and even possibly 5G electromagnetic field radiation, has two effects. One is it's toxic to the genes. So when you get degraded genes, the cells of your body will package them up. They're called exosomes, and they will look like a novel gene product. And the second is it seems to, in particular, the accentuated 4G and other electromagnetic fields and 5G, seems to interfere with the oxygen bioavailability. And so that could be the direct reason for seeing the hypoxic lung damage. And when you put those two together, I would submit that you have an explanation for this which fits all the observed facts and observations that we're seeing. Now, would I like this to be proven? Do I say that this is proven by double-blind studies right now? The answer is clearly no. But do I think there's enough evidence just like I think there's enough evidence with vaccines that we have urgent need to do these double-blind studies so that we know once and for all. Absolutely. This should be an urgent concern for everybody. Is this really safe? And the reason I bring this up is because it does seem like there's something new happening here, and this could be the explanation. And obviously it will change in different situations, and that provides the explanation, I think, as I said, that fits all the facts and observations. So that's what I called in my previous webinar, level 1. Level 2 gets into more sophisticated virology. And again, I would refer people to Andy Kaufman's brilliant talk, where we now know that if you poison a cell, and the poisons can be such things as toxins, electromagnetic fields, heavy metals. And one of the things that he showed that has apparently been demonstrated is simply fear. And I want to emphasize that again. Fear causes cells to release these exosomes, which are messages which look exactly like these so-called coronaviruses, which have all of these proteins in them, which were shown in the New Yorker or whatever magazine that was. All of those are found in the exosomes. This has been demonstrated. And the exosomes, I propose, are the rapid response team that tells other organisms, other cells, other tissues that we have encountered a new danger, we should respond. Now, if you think about this, if you use the normal model of how we adapt to environmental influences, meaning the survival of the fittest genetic model, here's how that would work. So you have 100 people exposed to a new toxin. One of them makes a mutation, which makes a protein that allows them to handle this new toxin. In order for that to spread throughout the population, you would have to have that person reproduce, wait for their children to grow up. Their children would have to have the same mutation. Then they would have to have children, and that would have to eventually spread all over the world where this toxin is present. And so I don't know exactly, but my estimate is that would take about 10,000 years, in which case there would probably be a new toxin. And so all I can say is that model is frankly ridiculous. So nature is not ridiculous. So it says, okay, I'm going to have a rapid response team. It's called exosomes. If I'm poisoned with a new toxin, I'm going to package that up into a message, which then I can send to all my friends, because we're actually living in a cooperative world, not a everybody for themselves world. No matter what we're told, that's just not the way nature works. So this is a simple example of spreading the message. It gets people to react. We've actually done experiments, not we, meaning me, but scientists, where they poison a rat with Tylenol, which is, everybody knows, a serious liver toxin. Those rats or mice, they excrete exosomes, which are essentially liver acetaminophen, Tylenol packaged up gene toxins. I'm not sure if that's the correct way to say it, but I think everybody knows what I mean. And then they expose other mice or rats to those exosomes, and they also have a reaction in their liver. So this is telling us that this is one way that nature has learned to spread the message, similar to how trees spread the message. We've been infested by beetles. All you friends of mine, all you other people, you make a reaction. And then unfortunately, if the other people who receive this message are also have an overactive immune response, because they too have been breathing aluminum dust, and they too have been injected with aluminum, and they too have been exposed to glyphosate, and they too have been had the oxygen in their air lowered because of electromagnetic fields, then you could have trouble, and it looks like the whole thing spreads. So that's level 2. And then if we want to be very realistic about this, we have to, even though it gets into more esoteric stuff, we have to talk about level 3, which is, there's no other way to say this. The physical matter, which we're told by the medical profession and scientists is the only thing that exists, is clearly nonsense. How do I know? Because the physicists say that these things that we're made out of, called atoms, they're 99.9% space. So the question of how something that's made of entirely space creates a chair or my foot or a virus is simply unknown and unanswered. And then, as I pointed out, it actually gets worse, because half the time these particles, which are space, they're not even present, and this substance is made only of waves. And so what is a wave? A wave is essentially an energy form, or you might even say an energy being, like fear, like hatred, like lying. And so these energy forms, which we know actually on a physical level, at least we know about fear, actually express exosomes. So we're starting to put this together, and then we could see, as has happened, that fear, hatred, and lying have spread all over the world. There's not a single person or living being who is not living in the environment of fear, hatred, and lying. And so that's simply another way that this could spread and could, quote, infect people all over the world. So to summarize, that's my theory. Now, that this is a multifactorial thing, the causation, the virus theory has not been proven. The PCR test is wildly inaccurate, has never been standardized. And we have multiple ways of envisioning how this could actually happen. And the final thing I'll say to this is, as most people know, I wrote a whole book about the relationship of water to this problem. Because after all, we're talking about degraded DNA, and then we have to realize that this structured, or some people call it coherent water, that the actual DNA is embedded in this coherent water, and the coherent water determines the expression or the integrity of the DNA and therefore the RNA. And I realize people would like me to have references on that, and believe me, I do, and in due time, maybe with the next book, if that's the way this goes, I will put all the references to say that I know that, to show how I know that. The other thing I would say is, I demonstrated in the vaccine book that when you get degraded cellular water, when the structure of the water degrades, it's like putting a poison grape in Jell-O. Your body has no choice but to create an immune reaction, an inflammatory reaction to dissolve the gel, excrete the poison grape so that you can reconstitute a new gel. So all of these influences fundamentally, in my opinion, have to work through a degradation of the water, which then sends out what can only be described as we are dealing with a message from water. That's how it is. We're dealing with a message from water. If people, you keep poisoning yourself physically, emotionally, mentally, that this is not going to go well. And the poison of the water is all the things I just said. And that's why when I talk about what to do, a lot of it is we need to purify the water in our body, and that's what we're going to do. So that took me a little longer than I thought. That's 45 minutes. And so now I'm going to transition to what can we do about this? And again, I just want to emphasize that I am not giving a prescription for any disease. I have no evidence that what I'm going to say will be an effective treatment for anybody with this situation. I don't know that he will be preventative or anything. I'm just giving my opinions. And all I can say is for those who want more information about chloroquine and vitamin C and all that, again, I would refer you to Andy Kaufman because he's doing an amazing job of documenting and explaining exactly how this works. And I would even also say, just because I'm referring people to Andy doesn't mean Andy agrees with all the things I say. He may or he may not, but yeah, so just take that for what it's worth. So what can we do? So the first thing, and when I explain what we can do, I'm also going to explain my level of evidence. So the first thing I would say is, the first thing we can do is protect ourselves and protect what some people call our warmth body from harmful electromagnetic fields. And so I learned something like 30 years ago that there was a theory that if you wore clothing or blankets made of peat, because peat moss is something that's formed after being in the earth for thousands of years. Apparently, it's the degradation product of all the plants, all the plant life that lives in these peat bogs, and they slowly degrade, and they essentially absorb the electromagnetic field from the earth. And if you make clothes or blankets out of these peat moss fibers, then it will protect you against certain negative influence in the environment. Let me be clear about this. I have no evidence that wearing a peat moss sweater or sleeping in a peat moss blanket will reduce your 1G, 2G, 4G, 5G exposure. In fact, my guess is if you used a meter, it wouldn't show that. So I have no evidence and I make no claim for that. All I know is that theory makes sense to me, and the people who do this essentially get a peat moss blanket. And the way this come about is a company from Germany contacted me, said, we heard you're talking about peat moss. Would you carry it for us? Because we can't get it in the United States otherwise. So we said yes, thanks to my sons and family who created a business around this. And that's why we're offering it. Again, I have no other evidence than that except what people say when they use the blankets. So that's number one. That's a very simple intervention, has nothing to do with the current situation, but is a way to protect your warmth body, your inflammation processes. A second one would be, I think people should eat good food. I've actually said this for about 40 years. And when I say good food, I mean nourishing traditions, because it doesn't have glyphosate, at least as much as you can. It has good fats. It is, in my opinion, the way to procure and process food. Now, let me just give you a few examples of the nourishing traditions diet, things to emphasize here. So there's another theory, and I would say that this isn't exactly proven, but one of the ways that you get these hemorrhages in the lungs is certain electromagnetic fields drive the calcium into the cell, and therefore you get lowered calcium in the blood. And since calcium is part of the coagulation pathway, then you end up bleeding because you're low in ionized calcium in the blood. So the whole nourishing traditions approach is, when it's seen properly, is a way to increase your calcium intake and increase your exposure to the proteins which actually structure the water in your cells. And so what do I mean by that? I mean bone broth. Bone broth is a way to extract the proteins from animal parts, and it has some amount of calcium, not a lot, but some. And so you end up getting the proteins that are used by your cells to help structure the water in your cells to make these more perfect crystals. So every morning, not just because of this, but because of years or so, I wake up, I make bone broth soup. And the way I make the broth is I get chicken feet, which are very cheap, and usually a bone marrow bone, like you can get bone marrow bones. I put them in my crock. I put a sheet of kombu seaweed, which is loaded with minerals. I put cholla buds, which are a food that, it's a wild food that we sell in our Dr. Cowan's Garden site because people couldn't get it otherwise. And it basically is loaded with calcium, which when you boil it, it dissolves the calcium into the broth. And then I put some dried reishi mushrooms, also called Ganoderma mushrooms. I simmer that with a little bit of vinegar for about 4 hours, and then I strain it. And that's what I make to use my vegetable soup every morning. And again, it's not a strategy for any disease. It's a strategy for helping the water and increasing the minerals in your diet. So that's number 2. Another way to get enough calcium in your diet is to eat products made from raw milk. Raw milk is essentially the perfect source of ionized calcium. I tend to like it cultured, so I make kefir or yogurt, and you can also use grass-fed ghee and butter. All that should be a part of every diet, and particularly a part of diet for now. And the final food I'll recommend is, we're talking about microbial integrity here. And so for literally decades, every single day, practically, I've eaten cultured, fermented vegetables, otherwise known as sauerkraut, kimchi, beet kvass, all those things that are part of the Nourishing Traditions diet. That's how you support and maintain your microbial integrity. And the rest of it is just the usual Nourishing Traditions diet, and I don't think I'm going to spend any more time on that now. So that's step 2. Step 1 is the blanket. Step 2 is the diet. Step 3 is probably, if not one of, maybe the most important part, and that has to do with something that I've had, I don't know how many hundreds or maybe more questions. What kind of water should I drink? Because obviously, if this is a problem of degraded, polluted water, if this is fundamentally a message from water that we have come to a fork in the road, and we either are going to degrade or we're going to start a new culture based on purified water, it would be a good idea to start with purified water, or proper water. That's better than purified. Scratch the purified. So what do I mean by that? And what I would say is that if you go back 100, 500, not 100, 500 years ago, 1,000 years ago, and you describe the characteristics of water, here's what I would say. Number 1, there's no stuff in the water. What do I mean by stuff? I mean aluminum and chlorine and chloramines and fluoride and glyphosate and birth control pills and Prozac and microplastics and a whole long list of about 100 other things. And I can guarantee that essentially everybody out there, except if you have access to a pristine spring, which maybe even doesn't exist anymore, all of you are drinking water with basically many, if not most, of those things in it. There may be some exceptions, people with wells and all, but everybody drinking water from a municipal tap has most of those, if not all those things in it. So you cannot have stuff in the water and have it be healthy water. So that's step 1. So again, all the water that humans used to drink bubbled up from the earth, from springs, or ran over rocks in streams. And in doing so, it picked up all the minerals. And so not only did we have water with no stuff in it, we had water that had the entire complement of minerals, not just 1 or 2, or I put some calcium or magnesium or something in the water, and now it has minerals. It had all the minerals of the earth in the water. And probably the earth got it from the sea, so it had all the minerals from the sea eventually show up in the water. That's step 2. Step 3 is all of this water was moving, and in particularly in patterns that we now call vortices. And in doing so, it picked up oxygen, and so we had moving, structured, coherent, oxygenated water, that's what people drink. And now when we examine the sort of sacred waters like Lourdes and other places, we always find that they're oxygenated and structured, and that's essentially the definition of one of the aspects of healthy water. That's step 3. You cannot have water that has no movement, that's dead in pipes, and that has almost no oxygen in them. That is not healthy water, and that's the water all of us are drinking. And the final step is, which is maybe getting even more esoteric, is this water that bubbled up from the earth or over streams was exposed to the electromagnetic fields, the energy, because we know that the function of water is to absorb all the energy of the cosmos and the earth, period. That's what it's doing in nature. That's what it's doing in our bodies. So this water in the streams was exposed to the frogs and the crickets and the birds and the songs of nature and the earth fields, and on and on and on. So in a sense, I like to describe it as the water was sung to, and that elevated the energy level of the water. And that is the 4 steps of assessing healthy water. Now, as I said, all the water in your tap has none of those 4 steps. It has stuff in it. It doesn't have the right minerals in it. It has very low, if any, oxygen in it. It is not structured or coherent. And it was sung to by mechanical pipes and all kinds of negative electromagnetic influences, and even not the birds, because apparently 90% of the birds, and I don't know what percent of the insects, are not even here anymore. So that's the problem. Now, a lot of people over the last months since the cancer book have sent me water to try. I've investigated them. I'm not a water scientist, but I've tried to learn what I can about how to evaluate this. And at the end of the day, my conclusion is there's only one water that I know of that fulfills all these 4 aspects, and that's a water made by a company called ophorawater.com. That's OPHORA water.com. And what they do is first nano purify the water, which means they're the only company that I've seen that can prove to me that they have no stuff in there, including plastics, including microplastics. And I'm now aware of just how difficult it is to get those things out of the water. I didn't know this 6 months ago. And they can demonstrate that they have gotten those things out of the water. And that's also the reason why they have never and would never put their water in plastic bottles. There is no justification in my mind for putting water in plastic bottles, with one possible exception, and that is there are deuterium depleted waters, and I'm not going to talk about deuterium depletion because it probably is relevant to this discussion, but it would take us too far afield, and I wrote about that in the cancer book. So there are good deuterium depleted waters that do come in plastic bottles that you could use in order to lower your deuterium levels, along with doing a test to find out what your deuterium levels are. So I can see that rationale, and that is a reason why you could use water in plastic bottles as a temporary measure. Otherwise, if our goal is to get the stuff out of the water, it has to be nano purified, it has to be proven that it is, and it has to be in glass bottles. Number 2, you have to add all the minerals from the sea and the earth back into it, and that's what Ophora does. Number 3, you have to put it through vortices, and I don't exactly understand the level of vortexes and crystals that they use, but I'm sure that that's what they're doing. And the reason that I know that is because by doing that, you increase the oxygen level in the water to 40 parts per million, which is much higher than any other water there is, at least that I know of. Now, when I first heard about this, I thought, well, we all know that you don't get oxygen in your blood through drinking water. I mean, that's kind of seemingly ridiculous. We get oxygen in our blood from the air that we breathe. And after all, this is partly an oxygen problem. So what difference does it make of the oxygen level in the water? The other thing I would say is the people at Ophora have also convinced me that as important as the water you drink is the water that you bathe in or shower in or vaporize into your house. And so to get into the level of proof, they have demonstrated to me with data, much to my surprise, and even though if I can't explain it necessarily, that drinking Ophora water with its increased oxygen level and bathing in Ophora water will actually increase the PO2 level in your blood and tissues. How that is, I would admit, a mystery, but that it is has been demonstrated. Now, the other way that you can demonstrate this is you can measure the lactic acid levels in the tissues. And I talked about lactic acid in my heart book. Because the lower the lactic acid level, that is a certain evidence that the higher the oxygen level, because the reason you make lactic acid is because your oxygenation goes down and then you switch your metabolism and then you make this lactic acid. So they've also conclusively demonstrated with studies that drinking and bathing in Ophora water will lower your lactic acid levels in your blood and in your tissues. And they can provide you with the studies if you want. Here's another possible explanation for that. Because again, much to my surprise, they provided me with evidence that if you water a plant with Ophora water, it will grow better and be healthier than plants watered with tap water. And one of the reasons they surmised that this would be is because the Ophora water has a higher level of oxygen in the water. And at first, when I heard that, you shake your head and you think, wait a minute, plants don't even use oxygen. This can't be relevant. This can't even be true. But on the other hand, you see the plants. They're healthier, they're more robust. Maybe it's just the structure of the water. We know that watering plants with structured water increases their health and their vitality. So at first, I couldn't believe that somehow watering plants with higher oxygen levels would possibly create a healthier plant. But then they presented me with evidence that it may not be that the plants actually use the oxygen, but certainly the microbes in the soil do. I mean, we know that if you increase the oxygen level to microbes, you will get a whole different population. And since the microbes, essentially, they excrete or secrete the entire nourishment of the plant, that could be a very plausible explanation of how watering the soil, so you're not actually watering the plant, I mean, you're watering the plant, but you're watering the soil, that changes the microbial population to a more robust and healthy variety, and that creates healthier and more robust plants. So there are other reasons why increasing oxygenation is good, and as I proposed in my hypothesis for what the problem is here, a lot of it has to do with somebody did something to the oxygen in the air and therefore in our blood. And what we're seeing is a hypoxic event. So it would make sense that if anything we could do, whether it's through changing our gut flora or the direct absorption of oxygen, I'm not sure, and I don't think anybody is, but it could have the exact same effect as oxygenating and therefore changing our own microbial population, which could then make us healthier and specifically even have more oxygen. So that's step 3. And then step 4 is essentially they sing to their water. They sing to it by a whole variety of techniques, which I'm not even sure of the details, but through music, through Brahms, through Beethoven, and I'm not sure of the details, but I know that that's a very big part of their whole procedure and operation, is you have to expose this water, which is an open book for all the electromagnetic fields and all the energies of the universe. You have to make it as coherent as possible, and so that's step 4. Then, as I said, it's bottled in glass bottles for people to drink, or you can get a home system which doesn't have the same oxygen levels, but that's another way to do this. Now, I just have to say that, as people have told me, this process is not cheap, and so I've tried to talk to them about, but listen, not everybody can do this. I don't even know if they have enough water if everybody decided today to order from them. I'm not sure if they even have the supplies. Maybe they do and maybe they don't. But even if they did, it's out of most people's price range. So the question that I had to ask myself is, what can people do like right now? So the first thing I would say is, one thing is to get as much of it as you can and use it as much as you can. And they also told me that as far as they can see, the best water that we know of, as far as all these 4 steps, that you can buy anywhere is called Mountain Valley Spring Water. And that comes in glass bottles, and it's relatively inexpensive. And one of the things that would be acceptable is to get 1 case of Ophora water and mix it 1 to 2, 1 to 10, 1 to 4, whatever you can afford, because the Ophora water will actually help structure and energize the other water, we think. And so that's an option for people who can't just switch entirely to Ophora water. I get that. If you can't do either of those, I would say the best solution is Mountain Valley Spring Water. I also want to say, I don't really want to hear from all the other water companies and all the other people that their water is the best. I mean no disrespect to anybody. I'm sure a lot of people are doing great things. I honor and respect them all. This is just what I've come to in examining this situation. Now, there is another option, which is something that we're working on making available. We don't have it yet. But again, this gets into a little more esoteric stuff, but that's who I am and the way I try to describe things, is Victor Schauberger, who probably knew more about water than anybody alive, described implosion devices where you could actually generate energy from water. And he actually created them where you put flowing water through something called an implosion device, which works, I guess, with vortexes and crystals and all kinds of things. And it actually creates energetic vortexes in the water, which create more robust health for the earth and for people and the plants and everything else. So there is a German company that contacted me and wondering if we could carry their water. And again, I would say I don't know of any particular scientific evidence that this helps with anything called pneumonia or hypoxia or anything like that. But here's what I do know. Just like I described how and why the blood moves in our body, the heart creates a suction, which actually sucks the blood up into the heart. And Schauberger said his implosion devices will recreate that suction, and you'll be able to see that, and that is your proof, in a sense, that this is creating a suction, which means you have vortexed energized water. So the question is, how can you prove that? And I would say anybody who wants to see the video, there's a website called AquaDea, I think it's .com or something, AQUADEA.com. And what you see on there is they put their shower device, which makes this implosion with crystals, and it comes out in these vortexes. And then you can put like a plastic cap, like a yogurt container, right underneath the water coming out of the shower head. So if you can imagine a heavy stream of water coming out for your shower head, and you put a very light yogurt cap on there, obviously the water's coming down, it will push the yogurt cap down just like you would expect. But what you see in the video is that the yogurt cap actually sucks up and is suspended underneath the shower head. And when you look at that, you say, I don't know what you say. You can't believe it, but there it is. It's true. That is creating a suction. And the theory is if you expose yourself to that suction, that energized vortex water, that will confer health advantages to you. So they have that, the shower device, and they also have a water device, which you can use. It has the same principles to purify your water. Now, the best thing is to use the best water purifier, and I don't want to say which one I think it is because I don't know. There's a lot of them. I don't want to choose sides here, but the best water purifier, you put it through this water device on your faucet, and that will do the same thing. Now, another reason I got convinced is that when you take water, like tap water, you can actually make crystals out of that. You can see that on their website. And the water from the tap has no shape, no form. The water from the shower or from the water from this faucet device looks like a magnificent fern-shaped organism, as if it's creating life forms. And so that tells you it has conferred structure and life in the water. You can see those on their website. But what was so interesting to me about this is when you put just unpurified water, so water that has all these toxins in it, and you put it through the shower device or the faucet device, and then you make a crystal picture out of that. What you see is a fern-like picture, and then you see little circular balls in there. And I can't say that I'm sure this is true, but I'm pretty confident that what that water is able to do, believe it or not, is encapsulate the poisons and make them harmless. Now, I have no proof of that, except that's the only explanation I can see. So again, hopefully we will be able to make that water device for your shower and your faucet available soon. And the final thing I'll say as far as, because we're talking about being poisoned here. And that's why I talk about this formula called immunity matrix. An immunity matrix is simply a mixture of medicinal mushrooms and vitamin C rich plants, essentially. So what do mushrooms do? They detoxify. How do I know that? Because you can do an oil spill and then you can put the mushrooms on it and you can come back in a month, and in certain situations, they essentially ate the oil. There's no toxic residue left. And now you could even eat the mushrooms, which, by the way, I wouldn't do. Mushrooms are the scavengers, the detoxifiers in nature. There's abundant medical evidence that they do the same in us. And since we are poisoned, which is my hypothesis here, it makes sense to avail ourselves of this amazing kingdom called medicinal mushrooms. Vitamin C is essentially, as Andy has suggested, an antioxidant, which will, to a certain extent, mitigate the effect of this hyper-inflammatory response that we're seeing in these people with lung inflammation. I'm not saying this is enough to treat it. If you have actual symptoms, seek competent medical advice. And that's the situation where they're using more high dose intravenous or liposomal vitamin C. So I can see the rationale for that. So those are the interventions. And again, none of them is specific to this. This is essentially how to live life in a toxic world. I'm going to finish here by saying one other comment here, which is, it seems to me that humanity is at a kind of a crossroad here. And one of the crossroads was exemplified by a story I had the other day, which is, I was walking in the park and there was a little boy playing. His mother was there, and I think probably his sister. He was playing with his ball, and the ball went, he lost the ball, and it rolled near somebody who was essentially lying or sleeping in the grass. And he took a step towards retrieving his ball, and then he looked at his mother with the most horrified expression on his face and said to the mother, "Am I safe?" And I thought to myself, if fear produces exosomes, which are how we diagnose this problem, we in humanity, if we're doing this to our children, this is a real problem. So I'm going to stop there with only the fork is, this is a message from water. Clean up our act. Stop poisoning the water, the air, the airwaves, the Van Allen belts, the ionospheres. Stop the 1G, the 2G, the 4G, the 5G. Stop the glyphosate. And otherwise, this is not going to go well. So with that, I will start to look at these questions. There's about 200 of them. I'm not going to get to them all, but I'll do the best I can. Here's one. Does metal in the body interact with 5G or any electromagnetic fields? As I explained the other time, the metals act as antenna. So people who have more metals in their body seem, I don't know if there's any absolute proof of this, will have more toxicity from any non-native electromagnetic field. Some of these are too long for me to go through. I would just want to say, when people ask me, how would I explain this to others, or my Aunt Bessie, she said, she doesn't believe this, or so, whatever. I mean, I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm trying to explain how I see the world. And I just feel like if you explain this in the most clear and coherent sense that you can, then some people will understand it and some people won't, and that's all you can do. And seems to me we have to love both of those kind of people, because not everybody's going to get it. I realize I'm not doing a great job of this question part. But here's something. Am I saying that viruses and exosomes are the same thing? Are just that COVID-19 and exosomes are the same due to the ACE2 cell reception? Again, I would please everybody watch Andy Kaufman's 40-minute talk on this. He explains the size of the exosome and the virus are the same. He explains the size inside and outside. The proteins inside the exosome are the same as what we're calling the coronavirus. The receptors are the same. And some of the most eminent virologists in the world are saying exosomes, i.e. messengers, are indistinguishable from viruses. This is only a semantic thing. And we have no way of saying this is an exosome and this is a virus. Some people are asking me about wearing a mask. And I don't want to say anything negative about what people feel like they have to do, or I'm not trying to get anybody to break laws or antagonize other people. Let's be very clear about that. But I would only point out that the size of a virus or an exosome is something like 1,000th or maybe 100th, or I don't know, some order of magnitude, maybe something like that. And again, Andy has the exact numbers on this. Smaller than the smallest mesh of any mask out there. I understand there's a theory that the mask is to keep you from touching your hands to your face, and maybe so the snot doesn't come out. I just have a lot of trouble with that. Here's a question: if they're not testing for immunity, but it's not a virus, what are the tests finding? Nobody is saying that a PCR test tests for immunity. That would be another surrogate test called an antibody. And they are developing antibody tests. But again, you cannot use a surrogate test if you don't have a gold standard test. That's just the facts, folks, whether we or anybody else likes it or not. What are the tests finding? They're finding a piece of RNA which they say is unique to this coronavirus, but they're also finding the identical exosome expressed from cells, which basically also have been shown to contain these poisons in them, just like I originally proposed. They're finding them expressed in people who have heavy metal toxicity. They're expressed from bacteria. They're expressed from lung cancer cells. They're expressed when people are exposed to fearful situations. That's what the medical literature says. If you don't believe it, go to Andy's references and he will demonstrate this. So there's a lot of reasons why we would find these exosomes, particularly if you take somebody's snot, which has literally millions of things in it, known and unknown. You incubate that in lung cancer cells, and then you purify it. God knows what you're going to get out of there. That is no way that anybody would prove viral causation. Somebody asked me about grounding jewelry and if he could speak to the effectiveness to protect against harmful effects of EMF. Number one, I am not an EMF specialist. My understanding is there's two ways to protect yourself against EMFs. One is to do the kind of shielding that these building biologists and shielding specialists, like, I don't want to mention any names, but there's lots of them who go in with their meters and measure the amount of EMFs that you're exposed to, and then they do certain things like put fabric, etc., and then they can prove to you that you have none of these electromagnetic fields in your bedroom or in your house, and I am 100% for that. I have a little bit of worries, well, let's say 99% for that, because I have a little bit of worries that they're also shielding out the beneficial electromagnetic fields from the heavens and the earth and Jupiter and the sun and all the rest of it. I don't know if that's the case, but I worry about that. So that is one way to help yourself. And there's a lot of people who have that information. Another way, which is what I think, if it was up to me, I would get rid of electronic wireless devices, period. I would get rid of the cell phones, all the electronic wireless infrastructure, because I think it's poisoning our water. Whether it's the direct cause of this or not, it's poisoning our water. And I think there's a case that it is a direct cause of problems in the forest, problems with insects, problems with human health. And there's abundant evidence to demonstrate that. And the other thing that I think you can do is what I talked about. the stronger your water is, the more coherent the water in your cells, the more resistant you will be to non-native electromagnetic fields. Crystals probably help with that. I happen to think that water and food and thoughts and prayers are probably the most potent. I understand there's still hundreds of other questions, but I only have 5 minutes left. And I want to answer another question which keeps being asked to me, which is, what would I do, or what is my suggestion for not only people, but the world? And I think it should be obvious by now that I think this is a turning point for humanity. And the issue is, this is a message from water to us to get rid of the poisons and clean up our act and all the poisons that I mentioned before it's too late. But there's another thing to say, because I think the isolation and the fear and the hatred and the lying and the division amongst people is probably, if not one of the most awful things that I've ever seen in my life. And so my wish for people, and that's the reason I talked about this song, is that when people feel comfortable, I don't want to rush anybody. I don't want to force anybody. I don't also want to exclude anybody. I don't want to exclude the people. I want to include the people who are supporting me. I want to include the people who are attacking me. I want us all to someday, when we're comfortable, emerge from our house, and what I would love is we all start singing Leonard Cohen's Hallelujah song. Because what I want to be remembered for, which is the line that this little boy sang at the end of the song, which is how I want to be remembered after all this, is I did my best, or I tried my best. It wasn't much. I told the truth. Hallelujah. So with that, thanks everybody for listening, and God bless, and we'll talk again.